Thank you very much, Willem. Well, I also thank the organizers for bringing me actually on this podium. The title of the presentation is Total Physical Activity is Associated with Positive Health Outcomes and Occupational Physical Activity is not. How come? First of all, I will explain a little bit about the state of the art and then go into detail on the how come question. I would like to explicitly thank Andreas Holtman who helped me with preparing this presentation. So basically, physical activity, I would say in the old days, because after this presentation you will think differently, is the magic pill preventing health problems. You know, stroke, coronary heart disease, obesity, diabetes, colon cancer, other types of cancer, depression, etc. Musculoskeletal disorders, not to forget that. Then the question, of course, is how does it relate to all-cause mortality? And this is a actually pretty recent review. You can see it's published in 2011, including studies until late 2009, where you can see that, well, the meta-analysis shows that total physical activity is indeed associated with a 1/3 reduced risk of all-cause mortality. So is exercise and sports, and physical activities of daily living, the same type of figure. For occupational physical activity at the time, the figure was still positive, 0.83, so it's a protective factor. Okay, then to get you a little bit on board, the literature in the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years is speaking of a health paradox of occupational and leisure time physical activity. And the basic question is, of course, if physical activity is such a magic prevention pill, how can it be on earth possible that the physically most active persons, those who work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, in a physically demanding job, have such a poor life expectancy? Well, your first thought will be, of course, that these guys also have other health behaviors that might be less healthy, which is the case, of course, but even if you, I will show you, even if you correct for all these unhealthy lifestyle behaviors, still physical activity at work is not healthy. So the question is, do occupational physical activity and leisure time physical activity have similar health effects? And I will focus on the evidence from recent prospective cohort studies. So this will be a, let's say, more epidemiological perspective. And I will have 3 questions during this keynote presentation. First of all, is it indeed so that occupational physical activity is associated with increased risk for mortality? And then the how come question will be divided in 2 parts. First of all, let's look at the methodological limitation of the cohort studies. Is it true what they find? And if so, then of course we are interested in the potential mechanisms of this harmful association. But let's start with the first one. And what I will do is I will start with 3 prospective cohort studies from Denmark, because that's where it all started. And after that I will get other cohort studies in other countries on board as well. First of all, we have the Copenhagen male study, which is a study of 5,000 males without cardiovascular disease at baseline, and they have 30 years of follow-up on ischemic heart disease and also alcoholism mortality. The second one is the Copenhagen City Heart study, which has 4,000 males also without cardiovascular disease at baseline, and 18 years and more follow-up on myocardial infection and also mortality. And then there's another study which is interesting because they don't have only males, they have 1,500 males and also 1,500 females, and they have 19 years of follow-up on all cohorts. So pretty impressive cohorts. The downside is, of course, it's all from them. Well, what are we looking at? And that's also something that you should keep in mind. We are looking at self-reported physical activity at work and also during leisure time. And the questions typically asked are, which description most precisely covers your pattern of physical activity at work? Well, the first category, which is categorized as low physical activity at work, is you are mainly sedentary, do not walk much around your workplace, for instance, desk work. And you have to walk around quite a bit at your workplace, but you don't have to carry heavy items. So light industrial work. And then the 2 highest categories where you walk and you have to lift various items, and the most heavy items where you have really physical work, you carry heavy burdens and carry out physically strenuous work, are combined into one category, the high occupational physical activity category. For leisure time, the same type of issue. So which description precisely covers your pattern of physical activity at leisure time? First, low leisure time physical activity, you're mainly sedentary, you read, watch television. You go for a walk, use your bicycle a little, perform activity for at least 4 hours per week, which is the moderate. And then you have the two highest categories where you either are an active athlete, you run, play tennis, etc., or you take part in competitive sports, swim, play European football, or whatever. So we have 3 categories for physical activity, both occupational and also leisure. Let's look at the first data. This is the Copenhagen male study, and we're looking about the ischemic heart disease mortality. Well, this is the adjusted hazard ratio, so 1 is the reference category for low physical activity at leisure time. Well, this is basically what we expect. Moderate activity will decrease the risk of mortality, and if you are highly active during the leisure time, you have an even more decreased risk. Now, for physical activity at work, the same type of figure. Low is 1, and then if you have moderate physical activity, the risk increases. And for high, it goes even further. There is one problem with this study, which is called, actually stated here. This is age-adjusted hazard ratio. This will be the last figure you see from my side where there's only adjustment for age. In all other studies, including the Danish, but also from other parts of the world, there's a, I would say, fully adjusted model where all kinds of potential confounders are included. The first one is the Copenhagen City Heart Study. As you can see here, adjusted for age, smoking, alcohol, body mass index, systolic blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, blood pressure medication, and also, importantly of course, leisure time physical activity and socioeconomic status, which was assessed by income. Again, what we see here is this is only occupational physical activity. For myocardial infection, you see increased risk in the moderate group and also an increased risk, although a little less, in the high occupational physical activity group. And for all-cause mortality, the picture is even more clear in terms that it's a nice dose-response relation. Okay, let's move on to the next. This is the Danish work environment cohort study. Remember, we have males and we have females. In this case, occupational physical activity is divided in quartiles. The lowest quartile is, of course, the reference category 1, and as you see also again here, there's a reasonable adjustment. Then the next quartile shows an increased risk, even further increase, and then the increase stops. But you can see here it's almost 2, so it's a pretty impressive risk estimate. For females, however, we hardly see risk. So this might also give us some indications on where the risk might be. Okay, this is a recent meta-analysis on studies of occupational physical activity and cardiovascular disease. And it's published in 2013, and it only took into account the cohort studies published in 2009, 2010, and no, I'm mistaken, 2010, 11, and a little bit in 2012. So only in the last, let's say, 2 and a little bit more years. What we see is actually that there is an increased risk for coronary heart disease, and the increase is 1.25. If we look at stroke, it's not really a huge increase, but still larger than 1. And if we look at unclassified cardiovascular disease, the risk is 1.47. And in this particular study, they also calculated an overall estimate, which was, I will go slowly, for the comparison of moderate physical activity to low, which is the reference here. It's a little bit increased, not statistically significant, but if you look at the comparison between high physical activity when compared to low, it is 1.24. Of course, there can be discussions, is it possible to combine these different studies into one estimate, but still the figure is pretty impressive. That is, it's consistently higher than 1. This is cardiovascular disease. I myself made an overview for mortality, which is all-cause mortality. And basically what you see is that the first studies came from Denmark, Boltzmann, Davis, and then we have a Belgian cohort here. This is the Hunt cohort from Norway. This is another Belgian cohort, not the same. This is a Taiwanese cohort. This is a cohort from Israel. And this is a cohort from the US. So we're not talking about Denmark anymore, we're talking about, let's say, the Western world, including some Asia. Well, what we see is not a single exception. They all show increased risks. And the only one that's pretty close to one is this one. It's a little bit of a strange estimate because they adjusted for heavy lifting. I would argue that heavy lifting is occupational physical activity in itself, so there might be some over-adjustment there. But the basic idea is that I wanted to show you is the recent cohorts, let's say starting in 2010 or 9, all show that physical activity at work is associated with an increased risk of all-cause mortality. And we're talking about fully adjusted models. Well, of course, there are some issues. You can always add some other confounders, but in general, most lifestyle behaviors, also blood pressure, leisure time physical activity, of course, and also socioeconomic status are included in these models. So, to answer the first question, is it indeed so that occupational physical activity is associated with increased risk? I would say yes, it is. The last couple of cohort studies consistently show this. However, there is, of course, I also showed the very first meta-analysis, there is a marked contrast between cohort studies before and after 2009. That's the kind of cutoff that I noticed. And, well, then the question is, of course, how is it possible? Well, personal communication says that there is some publication bias here. Some people saw already an increased risk in their cohort before 2009, so to say, but didn't publish it because they were doubting their own data. Are we actually in the correct way? Because, well, physical activity is good for us. And it gets a little bit worse because even the same cohort study, which is the Copenhagen City Heart Study, shows this remarkable tendency. A publication of Largo Anderson in JAMA, not a poor journal, showed a preventive effect of occupational physical activity, whereas the same cohort actually in 2012 showed an increased risk. Well, the argument there would be that there's maybe some latency period. It takes some time to develop cardiovascular heart disease and diaphragm. Of course, this is interpretation, and actually we don't know what is happening. But let's move on. There's another issue which kind of gives me a little bit more confidence. That is that the higher risk estimates can be seen in many other studies also. I showed you one for males and for females, which was already the case in 2009, where we saw that the protective effect was mainly for women, and for males the risk estimate was around 1. And what you see is actually that for both genders the risk estimate changed into the unfavorable direction. Okay, then we move on to the outcome question. First of all, I would like to focus on the methodological limitations, because of course, we have to look at it. And the most obvious one, I would say, is that occupational physical activity was always, in each of these cohorts, assessed by self-review. So they were asked whether or not they were physically active at work, yes or no. And it can, of course, be possible that the health paradox is actually caused by bias. Well, there's two types of, let's say, problems in self-report. First of all, there is the issue that people simply cannot estimate what they are doing, which would cause some random error. It gets a little bit epidemiologic, but I'll take you through it. If you have random error, it will, in the end, result in non-differential risk classification. And then by definition, the attenuation of the association will occur, which means that if you have risk estimate, it will go towards 1. And if you go towards 1, the change of direction is impossible. You cannot go from an increased risk to a decreased risk or the other way around. So random error or noise can, by definition, not be the underlying reason for this health paradox. Well, there's another issue, which is differential risk classification, and that's, I would say, the main suspect here. if the self-report bias is related to the outcome, then of course the true association, if it's lower than 1, can change into the found association, which is larger than 1. To give it a little bit more perspective, it could be that differential misclassification occurs if unhealthy workers, or unfit, physically unfit workers, tend to overestimate their exposure to occupational physical activity, and of course they are unhealthy, so they also die early, compared to their healthy colleagues. So this might be an issue. However, if I look at the data, I scanned all these papers with this in particular in mind, I don't see really large indications for this differential misclassification. And as an example, I will show you a study again of the Copenhagen Male study, where we see that for leisure time physical activity, there is still a nice protective effect of physical activity, which is not the case for physical activity at work. So in my line of reasoning, if people overestimate because they are physically unfit their physical activity, they will also probably do so for their leisure time physical activity. Okay, this is just an indication for one study where I found some, let's say, arguments to think that misclassification is not really an issue. The other issue, which is also a very important one, is the residual confounding. Because that's basically the defense zone of each person. If they find something that they don't expect, they say, well, that's residual confounding. Well, what is it? It is confounding of a variable which, for instance, socioeconomic status, which is of course a very important variable here for physical fitness. If it's measured imperfectly, then the adjustment using the imperfect measure does not completely remove the effect of the confounding variable. So if, for instance, let's say socioeconomic status or physical fitness would be measured with bias, it could be that the confounding is still in the analysis. Also, in this case, I did not really find it. I did not really see indications of this issue. Of course, it's very difficult to grasp, but there are some indications, and I will show you one. The one is this study where they only included lower social class men. So they made a stratification according to social class, and only the stratum of social class men with a lower category were included in this analysis. And then within this lower class social men, they stratified for tested physical activity, the physical fitness. So this is the figure. What you see is that among those with a low physical fitness, there's a huge increase. Actually, this is close to 3, which was not the case for those with medium physical fitness, and also not for those with high physical fitness. So this is, from a content perspective, for the outcome question, of course, an issue, and I will come back to it later. But this is presented here to show you that residual confounding is probably not really an issue. So then if I commit myself to these 2 large categories of bias, the answer to the question, do you think that the methodological limitation of the cohort studies actually cause the findings? I would say no. There is no serious bias by methodological issues. As you can see, there's a little question mark here left. This is because we cannot be sure fully. So now the question is, well, what could be the potential mechanisms explaining this association? And the first one is, I think that we are talking about 2 complete different issues. Physical activity at work is not the same thing as physical activity at leisure. To translate a little bit to the dietary behavior literature, if you have a certain amount of calories from McDonald's, it's definitely not the same in health perspective than a certain amount of calories from a meal cooked from your own backyard, because that's considered more healthy, of course. So at work we have to deal with low intensity physical activity, while at leisure most of the time is moderate or high intensity. At work it's long durations, 8 hours, so to say, and it's 5 to 4 days a week, meaning that we are talking about, let's say, elite sport, where you have this amount of exercise. So leisure is shorter and mostly less days per week. a worker hardly has any influence on the periods of rest or the variability or intensity. It's simply the worker has to do the job. And if you are running yourself, you can of course influence what you do. In general, I would say work involves smaller muscle groups. In leisure time, it's often involving larger muscle groups. And at work, there is a static component and also often some kind of repetition, which is not the case at that. So my main argument here is you have to you're dealing with two different types of physical activity. I already promised I would come back to physical fitness. What was done in the Copenhagen Male study was they actually measured physical activity, usually the Bostran's submaximal cycling test, and stratified it into three groups of physical fitness: low physical fitness, moderate, and high. And what you see actually is, first of all, an observation. What you see is that for those with low physical activity at work, moderate and high, there's hardly a difference in physical fitness, because the y-axis now is physical fitness. So apparently, by doing your job 8 hours per day, 5 days a week, you don't get any fitter, which is the case for leisure time physical activity. People get a higher aerobic capacity. Then, of course, the second question is, well, is it so for the full population? You saw already the data for the lower social class men, and this is the full population. Well, you see the same figure. It is actually, most of the risk is here in the low physical fitness group. So those who have high occupational physical activity and are low in fitness, they have the highest risk. And for the medium, it still is a little bit of an increase, and for the high fitness group, there is no effect of occupational physical activity. In the end, what you see here is, of course, the interaction between physical work activity and physical fitness is highly statistically significant. So fitness is an issue here, also in the mechanism. What you see if you actually measure physical fitness and also the number of steps and the heart rate over 3 working days for 22 female cleaners, which was published by what you see is that these female cleaners, they walk on average 20,000 steps. Remember, 10,000 is the health recommendation. They walk on average 20,000 steps. However, they still have no high cardiorespiratory fitness. So they walk, they work, but they don't get any training effect. And that's exactly what you see here. If the percentage of the working day is on the y-axis and the percentage of the heart rate reserve, meaning their, let's say, aerobic work demands, is on the x-axis. What you see is that they are pretty large amount of the day in the, let's say, fatiguing zone. They do something, but they are exactly 0% in the training zone, which is higher than 60% of the heart rate reserve. So that's, let's say, empirical evidence show that indeed they don't get any fitter. Basically what you see if you just look at the raw signal, those with low fitness are in this category but are never higher than 60, green line here is 60, and those with high fitness, they remain under these 30% and are not in the fatiguing zone and of course not in the fitness zone. Okay. Let's move on, because now we are moving to blood pressure, ambulatory blood pressure measurements. And this is done in the Belgian Stress 2 study, and they actually measured male and slightly older than hypertension without hypertension medication or cardiovascular disease. And they had a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure measurement and also accelerometer active graph measurements on a regular basis. Okay, what did they find? And I will take you slowly through this video. What we have here is persons who are either moderate or vigorous active during leisure time. So this is the persons who are highly active in leisure time, and this is the blue ones are the ones who are moderate or low active during leisure. This is the blood pressure in millimeter of mercury, and this is the mean work systolic blood pressure. What you see actually is that those who are low in activity during leisure have a higher blood pressure. Also when adjusted for gender, age, BMI, smoking, job strain, and usual level at occupational disorder. At home, they remain to be the ones with a higher blood pressure. This is all according to our theory and what we know. And during sleep, that was no different. So if you are active during your leisure time, your blood pressure will go down. That's basically what it says. Now we look at lifting of heavy loads. So those who are highly exposed to lifting and those who are low exposed. What we see is the opposite, actually. We see that those who are highly exposed have higher blood pressure. So the mean work systolic blood pressure is higher for those who are active than for those who are not active. And the same goes for the mean home systolic blood pressure. So if you work and you have to lift loads manually, your blood pressure at home will still be higher, and even during sleep. So basically what we see here is that those who are doing things at work have a sustained higher and elevated blood pressure. Okay, let's move on then to another study where also ambulatory blood pressures were measured, and they were actually connected to their aerobic workload as expressed in percentage of the heart rate reserve during one work. Now we're talking about cleaners, mostly females of course, but also some male cleaners here. And what we saw in this study, well, I should not say we, it's a matter, that with every 1% increase of the relative aerobic workload, we saw an increase in blood pressure. So the more they did, the more they did when compared to their own capacity, you saw that for each % increase in the relative workload, also the blood pressure, the systolic blood pressure increased with 0.42 millimeter mercury, and also the diastolic blood pressure. So the more they get actually to do at work, from a relative point of view, the higher the blood pressure. And another, I would say, earlier study, in my opinion, this actually study is the one who started the whole issue of thinking that occupational physical activity is not really healthy. What they did was they measured or asked by interview occupational physical activity at 3 time points, at baseline, 4-year follow-up, and also 11-year follow-up among 600 men. And they linked that to the change, 11-year change in ultrasonic graphically assessed intima media thickness. So pretty objective measure. And they looked at the change in this 11-year period. Well, what they saw was how they expressed occupational physical activity for each different way of operationalization of energy expenditure. They saw that high energy expenditures that were associated with accelerated progression of atherosclerosis controlled for many cardiovascular risk factors. Actually, the authors say pretty much all known cardiovascular risk factors were controlled for. And this effect was particularly found in older workers and also in those with either pre-existing ischemic heart disease or carotid artery stenosis. So basically, the higher you were, the higher your workload is, the worse the progression of atherosclerosis. So then, of course, we come back to the question of the potential mechanisms, explaining the association between occupational physical activity and mortality. I think there's 2 lines of reasoning that are actually a little bit connected. First of all, it might be so that prolonged elevated heart rate at work may cause a higher fraction of the cardiac cycle in the systolic phase, enhancing in the end then intravascular turbulence or wall shear stress. This is all hypothesis. This is not proven in studies, leading to inflammatory process in the arterial wall, eventually resulting in atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, and ultimately death. So this is a line of reasoning. There is some evidence, as I showed you, but this is actually, I think, the studies that there is. So 3, 4, maybe 5 studies showing physiological measures during work. But, of course, it remains to be studied. The other line of reasoning is a little bit along the same line, but still a little bit different. That is, if you have to have your heavy lifting in relatively short intervals, this may result in sustained elevated blood pressure. Remember, Belgian study. over the day, or even several very high peaks in blood pressure, which may also explain the progression of atherosclerosis, eventually resulting in cardiovascular disease and death. Also, this remains to be studied. Well, moving along these lines on what should be studied and what not, I think that what we need actually is objective field measurements of occupational physical activity, the time, the intensity, duration, variation in body movements, and also some physiological responses over several working days. We really need to know what is going on at the workplace. Then, of course, along these lines, the cohort studies should actually use these objective field measurements, and not only a baseline. If you have a follow-up of 30 years, it's a little bit tricky to only use the baseline measurements, and have, of course, follow-up on disease and mortality. Another issue, and that's on the confounding side, I think that the adjustments should also be done for psychosocial worker characteristics. That has been done in some studies, but not in all. We know that things like time pressure, social support, job insecurity actually have an effect on cardiovascular disease and also on death, so that should be adjusted. And finally, I think that we need experimental laboratory studies to disentangle the physiological differences between physical activity at work and during leisure time. And that could be, actually also be animal studies. Well then, some recommendations for policy. Basically, I think I have my point clear that heavy physical work demands should be prevented for many health reasons. Mortality is actually now one of them, apart from, of course, musculoskeletal disorders. At the same time, which was not the topic of my presentation, but we know that sedentary behavior is also not good. So, well, at the same time, the recommendation should be that sedentary behavior should be replaced by light and moderate intensity physical activities. So my main argument will be that actually what we need is a more nuanced policy recommendation, like, for instance, in the dietary discipline already there, of course. We should aim for an optimal physical activity mix at the occupational setting. And then maybe a last issue on the WHO recommendation, which was presented earlier this morning. I think actually the recommendation from the WHO is from the old days. Of course, there are very good elements, and physical activity as such should be promoted, but it should not be promoted at the worksite. Of course, it should be promoted if people are inactive or are sedentary all the time, but it should not be the recommendation that physical activity should be promoted at the worksite, because if you do it all day, you will die from it. So we should take into account the different health effects from physical activity at work and during leisure time. Okay, overall conclusions, to wrap up. The occupational physical activity is indeed associated with increased risk for mortality. I would say we have now 10 large cohort studies from many different countries, many different authors, so yes. How come? Are there methodological limitations? I would say no, with a little question mark. There are things that can be improved. And the potential mechanisms explaining the association are that physical activity and leisure time activity are physiologically rather different. And the mechanisms could go along the ways of physical fitness, increases in blood pressure, and in the end, atherosclerosis. Well, given this figure, I would say, well, where should we be? We should not sit. And we should not be very active. Well, a nuanced message is actually what you were waiting for. Thank you very much.